The rusted iron gates of Magnolia Grove Plantation hung askew on their hinges, creaking a mournful song in the humid Mississippi breeze. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her equipment bag and stepped through the gap, her boots crunching on the gravel path that had once welcomed carriages, filled with the southern elite. Now, only shadows and silence greeted visitors to this forgotten piece of American history. As a paranormal investigator and historian, Sarah had explored dozens of supposedly haunted locations across the South, but something about Magnolia Grove felt different. The air itself seemed heavy with unspoken stories, and the Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees swayed without any wind to move them. She had come here following reports from local residents about strange occurrences, voices singing in the night, figures walking through the fields, and an overwhelming sense of presence that made even the bravest souls turn away. The plantation house loomed before her, its white columns stained with decades of neglect and its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of time. Built in 1847 by Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore, Magnolia Grove had once been home to over 200 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields that stretched for miles in every direction. The plantation had thrived until the Civil War, when Union forces swept through Mississippi, liberating the enslaved population and leaving the grand house to slowly decay. Sarah pulled out her digital recorder and began documenting her initial observations. Day 1 at Magnolia Grove Plantation. The property spans approximately 2,000 acres, though most of the original structures have been lost to time and weather. The main house appears structurally sound, but shows significant deterioration. Local reports suggest paranormal activity has increased dramatically over the past 5 years. As she spoke, a sudden chill ran down her spine, despite the oppressive heat of the Mississippi afternoon. She turned slowly, scanning the empty windows of the house, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, as if dozens of unseen eyes were following her every movement. The front door stood slightly ajar, its brass hinges green with patina. Sarah pushed it open carefully, wincing as it groaned in protest. The interior was a time capsule of faded grandeur, crystal chandeliers draped in cobwebs, furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts themselves, and portraits of the Whitmore family staring down from the walls with eyes that seemed to follow her movement. But it wasn't the house itself that drew Sarah's attention. It was the stories she had uncovered during months of research. According to historical records, the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove had been particularly close-knit, with families that had lived and worked together for generations. They had their own quarters, their own traditions, and their own quiet resistance to the system that bound them. The most compelling account came from a diary kept by Mary Whitmore, the colonel's daughter, who had written extensively about the plantation's operations. In one entry dated March 15, 1863, she described a night when she heard singing coming from the slave quarters. Not the usual work songs or spirituals, but something different, something that made her feel as though the very earth was crying out for justice. Sarah made her way through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. In what had once been the colonel's study, she found a collection of plantation records that previous visitors had somehow overlooked. The ledgers contained detailed information about each enslaved person, their names, ages, family relationships, and the work they performed. As she read through the pages, the individuals began to emerge from the anonymity of history. Moses, the blacksmith who had fashioned tools and horseshoes; Celia, the cook whose recipes had been passed down through generations; Samuel, the field hand who had taught others to read in secret; and countless others whose lives had been reduced to mere entries in a white man's ledger. But it was the final entry that made Sarah's blood run cold. Dated April 12, 1863, it simply read, "All hands lost to fever, property abandoned. 200 people, an entire community, had died in what appeared to be a devastating epidemic that swept through the quarters in a matter of weeks. The Whitmore family had fled, leaving the bodies unburied and the plantation to nature's reclaim." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah heard it for the first time, a low humming that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her feet. She followed the sound outside, past the main house and toward the area where the slave quarters had once stood. Nothing remained of the original buildings except for a few foundation stones and the occasional chimney rising like a monument from the earth. The humming grew stronger as she approached, joined by what sounded like voices, not distinct words, but the cadence and rhythm of human speech. Sarah set up her recording equipment and began to document what she was experiencing. The electromagnetic field detector in her bag began to beep erratically, indicating significant energy fluctuations in the area. "The temperature has dropped at least 10 degrees since I entered this area," she spoke into her recorder. "I'm detecting multiple electromagnetic anomalies, and there's an audible phenomenon that sounds like singing, multiple voices harmonizing in what might be a spiritual or work song." As darkness fell completely, the activity intensified. Sarah could now make out individual voices within the chorus, a woman's soprano rising above the others, a man's deep bass providing the foundation, children's voices weaving through the melody like silver threads. The song was hauntingly beautiful, filled with both sorrow and hope, pain and resilience. Through her night vision camera, Sarah began to see them. Translucent figures moving through the area where the quarters had stood. They appeared to be going about their daily routines. Women hanging laundry on lines that no longer existed. Men returning from fields that had long since returned to forest. Children playing games in yards that were now overgrown with kudzu and wild grass. The figures seemed unaware of her presence at first, lost in their eternal repetition of life as they had known it. But gradually, some began to turn toward her, their faces becoming clearer in the green glow of her camera. These were not the stereotypical ghosts of popular imagination. They were individuals with distinct features, expressions, and personalities. An elderly woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, a young man with a defiant set to his jaw, a little girl clutching a rag doll to her chest. Sarah realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, not just a haunting, but a preservation of an entire community, a people who had been erased from official history but who refused to be forgotten. The fever that had claimed their lives had somehow bound them to this place, creating a spiritual sanctuary where their stories could continue to be told. As the night deepened, more figures appeared, until Sarah estimated she was seeing close to the full population that had once lived at Magnolia Grove. They moved with purpose and dignity, their presence a powerful reminder of lives that had mattered, of dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed, of a community that death itself could not silence. The singing continued until dawn, when the figures gradually faded with the rising sun. But Sarah knew they would return, as they had every night for over 150 years, keeping their stories alive in the only way they could. She packed her equipment with trembling hands, knowing that her investigation had only just begun. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had accepted her presence, and she had a responsibility to help tell their stories to a world that had tried so hard to forget them. Sarah returned to Magnolia Grove the following evening, this time accompanied by Marcus Williams, a local historian whose great-great-grandfather had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Marcus had reached out to her after hearing about her investigation, offering his expertise in African-American genealogy and his deep knowledge of the region's hidden history. "My family's been telling stories about this place for generations," Marcus explained as they walked through the plantation grounds. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits here weren't restless. They were waiting for someone to listen, to remember, to tell their truth." As they approached the area where the slave quarters had stood, Sarah shared her recordings from the previous night. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more solemn with each passing moment. When the voices began to sing in the recording, tears formed in his eyes. "That's Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," he whispered. "But they're singing it different, adding verses I've never heard before." My grandmother used to say that enslaved people would change the songs, add their own words to carry messages that the masters couldn't understand. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. As darkness approached, the temperature began to drop, and the electromagnetic readings on Sarah's equipment started to fluctuate. But tonight, something was different. The spirits seemed more aware, more focused, as if they had been preparing for this encounter. The singing began earlier than the previous night, and this time, individual voices were clearer and more distinct. Sarah and Marcus positioned themselves near the foundation stones of what had once been the largest cabin in the quarters, setting up multiple cameras and recording devices to capture every detail. "Can you hear us?" Sarah called out softly into the gathering darkness. "We're here to listen to your stories." The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that even the usual night sounds of the Mississippi countryside seemed muted. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize near the old foundation, an elderly man with silver hair and deep-set eyes that held both wisdom and pain. "I am Moses," the figure spoke, his voice carrying clearly despite its ethereal quality. "I was the blacksmith here, and I speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." Marcus gasped, recognizing the name from the plantation records Sarah had discovered. Moses had been mentioned repeatedly in the ledgers, not just as a skilled craftsman, but as a leader among the enslaved community. "We have been waiting," Moses continued, his form becoming more solid and defined, "waiting for someone who would hear our truth, not the lies written in the Master's books. We died here, all of us, but not from fever as they claimed. We died from poison, from water tainted by those who feared our freedom more than they feared God's judgment." Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted her recording equipment. This was far beyond anything she had expected, direct communication with a spirit who seemed to retain full consciousness and memory of his life and death. "Tell us what happened," she urged gently. "Help us understand." Moses gestured toward the area where other figures were beginning to appear, men, women, and children of all ages, their forms growing clearer as the night deepened. The war was ending, and we knew freedom was coming. Some of us had already begun to plan, to dream of lives beyond these fields. But Colonel Whitmore, he couldn't bear the thought of losing his property, his wealth, his way of life. A woman materialized beside Moses, tall and dignified, with graying hair wrapped in a colorful headwrap. "I am Celia," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been responsible for feeding an entire community. "I prepared the meals, and I was the first to notice something wrong with the water. It tasted bitter, wrong, but by then it was too late." More spirits gathered around them, each adding their voice to the growing testimony. Samuel, the field hand who had taught others to read, spoke of the secret schools held in the woods after dark. Ruth, a young mother, told of hiding her children when the sickness began to spread, only to watch helplessly as they succumbed one by one. Benjamin, barely 16 when he died, described his dreams of becoming a teacher in the north. "The colonel told everyone it was fever," Moses continued, his voice heavy with anger and sorrow. "But we knew the truth. He poisoned the well that served our quarters, thinking it would be seen as divine judgment, a sign that we were not meant to be free. He fled before the Union soldiers arrived, leaving our bodies to rot in the sun." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was evidence of a mass murder that had been covered up for over 150 years, hidden beneath the more palatable narrative of disease and natural death. "Why didn't anyone investigate?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A bitter laugh escaped from Moses. Who would investigate the deaths of slaves? Who would question the word of a white colonel against the silence of the dead? Our lives had no value to them in life. Why would our deaths matter? As the night progressed, more spirits shared their stories. Sarah learned about the complex social structure within the enslaved community, the ways they had maintained their humanity and dignity despite the dehumanizing system that bound them. She heard about secret marriages that weren't recognized by law, but were blessed by their own traditions, about children who learned their heritage through whispered stories and hidden songs, about acts of quiet rebellion that kept hope alive in the darkest times. Celia spoke of the recipes she had created, blending African traditions with available ingredients to create dishes that nourished both body and soul. Samuel described the network of communication that had existed between plantations, carrying news of the war and rumors of freedom from farm to farm. Ruth sang lullabies that her own mother had sung to her, songs that carried the memory of a homeland most of them had never seen, but somehow still remembered. But it was the children's stories that affected Sarah most deeply. Little Mary, who had died at age 7, spoke of games played in the dirt between the cabins, of dolls made from corn husks and scraps of fabric, of dreams of learning to read and write like the white children she had glimpsed from afar. Thomas, who had been 12 when he died, described his plans to find his father, who had been sold to another plantation when Thomas was just 5 years old. "We stayed because this was our home," Moses explained as the night began to wane. "Not because we chose it, but because we made it ours. Our sweat watered this soil, our tears blessed this ground. Our love created families and communities that transcended the bonds of slavery. We could not leave, because to leave would be to abandon all of that, to let them erase us completely." As dawn approached, the spirits began to fade, but their message was clear. They wanted their story told, not the sanitized version found in history books, but the truth of their lives, their deaths, and their enduring presence at Magnolia Grove. They wanted the world to know that they had been more than property, more than statistics in a ledger, more than footnotes in someone else's story. "Will you help us?" Moses asked, as his form became translucent in the growing light. "Will you tell our truth?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise," she whispered. "I promise I'll tell your story." As the sun rose over Magnolia Grove, Sarah and Marcus sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. They had come seeking evidence of paranormal activity and had instead uncovered evidence of a crime that had been hidden for generations. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove weren't just haunting the plantation, they were bearing witness to an injustice that demanded recognition and remembrance. The investigation had become something much larger than either of them had anticipated. It was now a mission to restore dignity to the dead and to ensure that their voices, silenced for so long, would finally be heard. On the third night, Sarah and Marcus were joined by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Mississippi who had driven down after hearing about their discoveries. Dr. Hartwell brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and other scientific instruments that might help locate the unmarked graves of the 200 souls who had perished at Magnolia Grove. "If what you've documented is true," Dr. Hartwell said as she calibrated her equipment, "then we're looking at one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the region. Mass graves from the antebellum period are incredibly rare, and the circumstances you've described would make this a crime scene that's been cold for over 150 years. As they worked to set up the scientific equipment alongside Sarah's paranormal detection devices, the familiar chill began to descend over the plantation grounds. But tonight, the spirits seemed more organized, more purposeful in their manifestations. They appeared in groups, as if presenting themselves for formal testimony. Moses materialized first, as he had the previous nights, but this time he was accompanied by a woman Sarah hadn't seen before, elderly, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had served as both healer and spiritual leader for her community. "This is Mama Esther," Moses said, his voice carrying deep respect. "She was our root doctor, our midwife, our keeper of the old ways. She knows where we rest." Mama Esther stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her translucent form. "Child," she addressed Sarah directly, "you seek our bones, but you must understand, we are not just in the ground. We are in the trees that grew from our bodies, in the soil that drank our blood, in the very air that carries our songs. Dr. Hartwell, initially skeptical of the paranormal aspects of the investigation, found herself unable to deny what she was witnessing. Her scientific instruments were registering phenomena that defied conventional explanation: temperature fluctuations that followed no natural pattern, electromagnetic signatures that seemed to respond to the spirit's presence, and ground disturbances that appeared and disappeared in correlation with the manifestations. "Show us," Sarah requested gently. "Help us find where you were laid to rest." Mama Esther began to walk, her form gliding over the uneven ground with ethereal grace. She led them away from the main area where the quarters had stood, toward a grove of ancient oak trees that stood about a quarter-mile from the main house. As they followed, other spirits joined the procession, a solemn parade of the dead, leading the living to their final resting place. "Here," Mama Esther said, stopping in a clearing surrounded by the massive oaks. "They threw us in pits, like we were animals. No prayers, no ceremony, no respect for the journey our souls were taking. But the earth knew, the earth remembered." Dr. Hartwell immediately began scanning the area with her ground-penetrating radar, and the results were both fascinating and horrifying. The equipment revealed multiple large depressions in the earth, consistent with mass burial sites. The irregular shapes and sizes suggested hasty, careless interment, exactly what would be expected if bodies had been disposed of quickly to hide evidence of wrongdoing. "There are at least 6 separate burial sites," Dr. Hartwell reported, her voice tight with professional excitement and human revulsion. "The largest appears to contain approximately 50 individuals, while the smaller ones range from 15 to 30 bodies each. The total is consistent with your estimate of 200 people." As the night progressed, the spirits began to share more details about their final days. Samuel, the teacher, described how the sickness had spread rapidly through the quarters, but in a pattern that didn't match any natural disease. "It started with the children," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "They were always thirsty, always drinking from the well. Then the pregnant women, then the elderly. Those of us who were strong, who worked in the fields and drank from the creek, we lasted longer." Celia, the cook, provided the most damning testimony. "I saw the colonel's son, Master Robert, near the well the night before the sickness started. He was pouring something from a bottle into the water. When I asked what he was doing, he told me it was medicine to keep us healthy. But I knew by the way he looked at me, by the fear in his eyes. He knew what he was doing." The revelation that it had been Robert Whitmore, not his father, who had actually carried out the poisoning, added another layer of horror to the story. According to the spirits, Robert had been a young man of 22, recently returned from college in the north, where he had been exposed to abolitionist ideas. But instead of embracing these progressive thoughts, he had reacted with violent opposition, becoming even more extreme in his views than his father. "He couldn't bear the thought of us being free," Moses explained. "He saw us as property, as things that belonged to his family. The idea that we might leave, might build our own lives, might be equal to him, it drove him to madness." Dr. Hartwell's equipment revealed another disturbing detail. The burial sites showed evidence of lime deposits, suggesting that quicklime had been used to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence. This was not the work of someone disposing of disease victims, but of someone deliberately trying to hide a crime. As the investigation continued, the spirits began to reveal information about a network that had existed among the enslaved communities throughout the region. Samuel spoke of secret meetings held in the woods, where representatives from different plantations would gather to share information about the war, about opportunities for escape, and about the changing political landscape. "We knew freedom was coming," he said. "We had been preparing for it, planning for it. Some of us had already made contact with Union sympathizers in the area. There was a network, a way to get people to safety when the time came." Ruth, the young mother, described how they had been teaching their children to read and write in preparation for freedom, using materials stolen from the main house and lessons conducted in secret after the day's work was done. "We wanted them to be ready," she said, tears visible even in her spectral form. "We wanted them to have the tools they would need to build new lives." The spirits revealed that Magnolia Grove had been intended as a way station on what would have been an extended underground railroad network designed to help newly freed slaves transition to independent life. Plans had been made for the community to purchase land collectively, to establish schools and businesses, to create a model of what freedom could look like for formerly enslaved people. "That's what they feared most," Moses said. "Not just our freedom, but our success. They couldn't bear the thought that we might prove we were their equals, that we might build something better than what they had created through our bondage." Mama Esther shared the most heartbreaking detail of all. In the final days, as the poisoning took its toll, the community had continued to care for one another. The healthy had tended to the sick, parents had comforted dying children, and the spiritual leaders had provided what comfort they could to those facing death. "We died as we lived," she said with quiet dignity. "As a family, as a community. They could take our lives, but they could not take our love for one another." As dawn approached, the spirits gathered one final time around the burial sites. Moses stepped forward to address Sarah, Marcus, and Dr. Hartwell directly. "You have seen our truth," he said. "You have heard our testimony. Now you must decide what to do with this knowledge. We cannot rest until our story is told, until the world knows what happened here, until our children's children understand that we were more than victims. We were people with dreams, with plans, with love for one another that death itself could not destroy." The morning sun began to filter through the oak trees, and the spirits slowly faded from view. But their message was clear. The investigation at Magnolia Grove had uncovered not just a paranormal phenomenon, but evidence of a historical atrocity that demanded justice, even after 150 years. Dr. Hartwell packed her equipment with shaking hands. "This changes everything," she said. "This isn't just an archaeological site. It's a crime scene. We need to contact the authorities, the university, the media. This story needs to be told." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had entrusted her with their truth, and she would not let them down. The investigation was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Word of the discoveries at Magnolia Grove spread quickly through academic circles and beyond. Within a week, the abandoned plantation was swarming with archaeologists, historians, journalists, and curiosity seekers. The Mississippi State Archaeological Commission had taken control of the site, and Dr. Hartwell was leading the official excavation of the burial grounds. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she hadn't anticipated. News outlets from across the country were calling, wanting interviews about the psychic detective who had uncovered a Civil War-era mass murder. But she was more concerned about the spirits themselves, who seemed agitated by all the activity and attention. "They're not at peace," Marcus observed as they watched the excavation from a distance. The archaeological team had cordoned off the burial sites and was working methodically to uncover and document the remains. All these strangers digging up their bones, treating them like specimens instead of people. That evening, as the work crews departed and the site fell quiet, Sarah and Marcus returned to commune with the spirits. The manifestations were stronger than ever, but there was an urgency to them now, a sense that time was running out for something important. Moses appeared first, as always, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced by visible distress. "They come with their tools and their cameras," he said, "but they do not come with respect. They measure our bones and catalog our teeth, but they do not see us as we were." Mama Esther materialized beside him, her spiritual authority evident even in death. "The young ones are frightened," she said, referring to the children who had died in the poisoning. "They don't understand why strangers are disturbing their rest." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. In her eagerness to expose the truth and seek justice for the victims, had she inadvertently caused them more suffering? "What can we do?" she asked. "How can we help them find peace?" "Tell our names," Moses replied. "Not just that we died, but who we were. Tell our stories, our dreams, our love for one another. Make them remember that we were people, not just victims." Over the following nights, as the excavation continued during the day, Sarah worked with the spirits to document their individual stories. Each person who had died at Magnolia Grove had a unique history, relationships, talents, and aspirations that had been cut short by Robert Whitmore's poisoning. There was Isaiah, the carpenter who had built most of the furniture in the slave quarters and had dreamed of opening his own workshop after freedom came. His hands, he said, had been blessed with the ability to create beauty from raw wood, and he had been teaching his son the trade in secret. There was Miriam, the seamstress who had created intricate quilts that told stories of their African heritage in patterns that the white family never understood. She had been planning to use her skills to earn money for her family's freedom, one stitch at a time. There was Joshua, barely 18, who had been learning to read from Samuel and had planned to become a preacher. He spoke of sermons he would never give, of souls he would never save, of a calling that death had silenced but not destroyed. Each story was a testament to the humanity that slavery had tried to deny, the dreams that bondage had attempted to crush, the love that had flourished even in the darkest circumstances. Sarah documented every detail, knowing that these stories were as important as any physical evidence the archaeologists might uncover. Meanwhile, Dr. Hartwell's team was making disturbing discoveries that confirmed the spirit's testimony. The remains showed clear evidence of poisoning, bone deterioration consistent with arsenic exposure, traces of the poison still detectable in hair and nail samples that had been preserved in the Mississippi clay. More significantly, they found evidence of the quicklime that had been used to accelerate decomposition. Chemical analysis of the soil revealed concentrations of calcium oxide that could only have come from deliberate application. This wasn't disease, it was murder, carried out with premeditation and covered up with scientific precision. The discovery of personal effects buried with the bodies provided another layer of evidence. Unlike typical slave burials, which were often conducted with minimal grave goods due to poverty, these burials contained items that suggested the victims had been preparing for freedom. There were hidden caches of coins, carefully preserved documents, and even a few pieces of jewelry that would have been valuable enough to provide starting capital for new lives. They were ready, Dr. Hartwell reported to the growing crowd of media and officials. These people weren't just dreaming of freedom, they were planning for it, saving for it, preparing their children for it. The poisoning wasn't just murder, it was the destruction of an entire community's future. As the excavation progressed, Sarah noticed changes in the spiritual activity at the site. The children's spirits, initially frightened by the disturbance, began to appear more frequently, as if they understood that their stories were finally being told. Little Mary, the 7-year-old who had spoken of her rag doll, led Sarah to a spot where archaeologists subsequently found the remains of several handmade toys, evidence of childhood that had persisted even in bondage. But it was the discovery of the school that provided the most powerful testimony to the community's preparations for freedom. Hidden beneath what had appeared to be a storage shed, archaeologists found a cache of books, writing materials, and educational supplies that the enslaved community had accumulated in secret. Samuel's spirit guided them to the location, his pride evident even in death. "We were not the ignorant savages they claimed we were," he said as Sarah watched the archaeologists carefully excavate the hidden classroom. "We thirsted for knowledge as much as we thirsted for freedom. We knew that education was the key to true liberation. The books were a revelation, Not just basic primers and religious texts, but advanced mathematics, literature, and even political philosophy. The enslaved community at Magnolia Grove had been preparing to enter free society not as helpless dependents, but as educated, capable citizens ready to contribute to the rebuilding of the South. As news of these discoveries spread, descendants of other enslaved families began coming forward with their own stories and family histories. Marcus's research had connected him with genealogical networks throughout the region, and the investigation at Magnolia Grove was inspiring other communities to examine their own hidden histories. One particularly significant visitor was Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly woman from Jackson who claimed to be the great-great-granddaughter of Celia, the cook whose spirit had been so prominent in Sarah's investigations. Mrs. Washington brought with her a collection of recipes that had been passed down through her family, recipes that she claimed had originated at Magnolia Grove. When Celia's spirit appeared that evening, the reunion was deeply moving. The ghost and her descendant couldn't interact directly, but Sarah served as an intermediary, relaying messages between them. Celia wept spectral tears as she learned about her family line, about children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had survived and thrived despite the tragedy that had claimed her life. "My recipes lived," Celia said through Sarah. "My knowledge, my traditions, my love, they survived even when I could not." Mrs. Washington had brought one of the original quilts that Miriam the seamstress had created, a family heirloom that had been carefully preserved for generations. When Miriam's spirit saw her work still intact, still treasured, still telling its story after all these years, her joy was palpable. These connections between the living and the dead began to change the nature of the haunting at Magnolia Grove. The spirits seemed less agitated, more at peace, as if the recognition of their humanity and the preservation of their legacy was beginning to heal wounds that had festered for over a century. But there was still one more revelation to come, one that would transform the investigation from a historical curiosity into a modern legal case. Hidden among the plantation records that Sarah had discovered in the main house was a document that no one had noticed during the initial examination, a confession letter written by Robert Whitmore himself. The letter, dated April 15, 1863, just 3 days after the final entry in the plantation ledger, was addressed to his father, but apparently never sent. In it, Robert detailed his actions and his motivations with chilling clarity. "Father, I have done what needed to be done to preserve our way of life and our family's honor. The Negroes were becoming too bold, too hopeful. They spoke of freedom as if it were their right, as if they were our equals. I could not allow such blasphemy to stand. The poison was quick and merciful, more merciful than they deserved. I have told everyone it was fever, and none questioned the word of a Whitmore. Our secret dies with them." The letter was signed and dated, providing legal documentation of premeditated murder. Even 150 years later, it was evidence of a crime, and legal scholars began debating whether there was any statute of limitations on mass murder, even historical mass murder. As Chapter 4 drew to a close, Sarah realized that the investigation had evolved far beyond anything she had initially imagined. What had begun as a paranormal investigation had become a historical reckoning, a legal case, and a spiritual healing all at once. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had succeeded in their goal. Their story was being told, their humanity was being recognized, and their legacy was being preserved for future generations. But the most important transformation was yet to come, as the living and the dead worked together to ensure that the victims of Magnolia Grove would finally receive the dignity and justice that had been denied to them for so long. 3 months after the initial discovery, Magnolia Grove Plantation had been transformed from a forgotten ruin into a site of national historical significance. The excavation had been completed, and all 200 sets of remains had been carefully exhumed, studied, and prepared for proper burial. The evidence of mass poisoning was overwhelming and undeniable. supported by both scientific analysis and the confession letter that had sealed Robert Whitmore's guilt across the centuries. Sarah stood in the grove of oak trees where the mass graves had been found, watching as workers prepared the site for a memorial service that would finally give the victims the dignity they had been denied in death. Each person would be reburied in individual graves, marked with headstones bearing their names and the stories that Sarah and Marcus had painstakingly documented with the help of their spirits. The memorial service was scheduled for the anniversary of their deaths, April 12th, exactly 160 years after the poisoning. Descendants of the victims had traveled from across the country to attend, along with historians, civil rights leaders, and government officials who recognized the significance of what had been uncovered at Magnolia Grove. But for Sarah, the most important attendees would be invisible to most of the crowd. The spirits had been increasingly active as the memorial date approached, and she could sense their anticipation, their hope that this ceremony might finally allow them to find peace. The night before the memorial service, Sarah made one final visit to commune with the spirits. Moses appeared as always, but his demeanor was different, calmer, more serene, as if a great burden was finally being lifted from his shoulders. "Tomorrow we will be remembered," he said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "Not as property, not as statistics, but as people who lived and loved and dreamed. That is all we ever wanted." Mama Esther materialized beside him, her spiritual authority evident even as her form seemed somehow lighter, less bound to the earthly plane. "The children are ready," she said. "They understand now that they are not forgotten, that their stories will live on in the hearts of those who come after." One by one, the other spirits appeared. Celia with her recipes and traditions, Samuel with his books and dreams of education, Ruth with her lullabies and mother's love, Isaiah with his craftsman's hands, Miriam with her storytelling quilts. All 200 souls manifested in the grove, creating a congregation of the dead that filled the space between the ancient oaks. "We have one final gift for you," Moses said to Sarah. "A story that we have kept hidden until now, waiting for the right time to share it." The spirits began to speak in unison, their voices weaving together to tell a tale that had been preserved in their collective memory for 160 years. It was the story of the last night before the poisoning began, when the community had gathered for what they didn't know would be their final celebration together. They had been planning for freedom, yes, but they had also been celebrating their bonds with one another. There had been music and dancing, storytelling and laughter, prayers and dreams shared under the stars. Children had played while adults made plans for the future. Couples had spoken of weddings they would have when they were free to marry legally. Parents had imagined schools their children would attend. "We were not just surviving," Celia said, her voice filled with remembered joy. "We were living, we were loving, we were hoping. That is what they tried to destroy, but that is what lives on." The spirits shared memories of that final night, the songs they had sung, the stories they had told, the dreams they had dared to voice aloud. It was a celebration of life that had taken place in the shadow of death, a testament to the human spirit's ability to find joy even in the darkest circumstances. As dawn broke on the day of the memorial service, the spirits began to fade, but their message was clear. They were ready to rest, knowing that their stories would continue to be told, their humanity would be remembered, and their legacy would inspire future generations. The memorial service itself was a powerful blend of historical recognition, spiritual healing, and community celebration. Dr. Hartwell presented the scientific findings that had confirmed the spirit's testimony. Marcus shared the genealogical research that had connected modern families to their ancestors. Civil rights leaders spoke about the continuing struggle for justice and equality. But the most moving moment came when Mrs. Dorothy Washington, Celia's descendant, read from a cookbook she had compiled using the recipes that had been passed down through her family. As she spoke about the dishes that had nourished the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove, many in the crowd could swear they smelled the aromas of cornbread and collard greens, of sweet potato pie and fried chicken carried on the wind. Sarah had been asked to speak about her paranormal investigation, but she found herself struggling to find words that could adequately convey what she had experienced. How could she explain the profound humanity of the spirits she had encountered? How could she describe the dignity with which they had faced both life and death? How could she make people understand that these weren't just ghosts, but teachers who had waited 160 years for students willing to learn? "They taught me that history isn't just about dates and facts," she finally said to the assembled crowd. "It's about people. Real people with real lives, real dreams, real love for one another." The spirits of Magnolia Grove didn't haunt this place because they were angry or vengeful. They stayed because they had stories to tell, lessons to teach, and love to share. They stayed because they refused to let their humanity be erased. As the individual headstones were dedicated, each bearing a name and a brief description of the person buried beneath, Sarah could see the spirits standing beside their graves. They appeared more solid, more at peace than she had ever seen them. Children played among the headstones, while adults stood with quiet dignity, finally receiving the recognition they had been denied in life. The ceremony concluded with the planting of 200 new oak trees around the memorial site, each one representing a life that had been cut short, but whose legacy would continue to grow. As the saplings were placed in the ground, Sarah noticed that the spirits were beginning to fade, not with the abrupt disappearance she had witnessed before, but with a gradual, peaceful transition that suggested they were finally ready to move on. Moses was the last to fade, and he approached Sarah one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "You kept your promise. You told our story." Will I see you again?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing how much she would miss these nightly conversations with the past. Moses smiled, his form becoming translucent in the afternoon sunlight. "We will always be here, in the stories you tell, in the memories you preserve, in the lessons you teach. Death could not silence us, and now nothing ever will." As the sun set on the memorial service, Sarah stood alone among the new headstones and young oak trees. The electromagnetic readings on her equipment showed no unusual activity. The temperature was normal for a Mississippi evening in April. The voices that had filled the night air for months were silent, but the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, the quiet of souls finally at rest. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had completed their mission. Their stories had been told, their humanity had been recognized, and their legacy had been secured for future generations. In the months that followed, Magnolia Grove became a site of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the true history of slavery and its aftermath. The plantation was converted into a museum and educational center, with exhibits that told the stories of the 200 individuals who had lived and died there. Sarah's recordings of the spirits' testimonies became part of the permanent collection, ensuring that their voices would continue to be heard. The legal implications of Robert Whitmore's confession letter continued to reverberate through academic and legal circles. While no criminal charges could be filed against someone who had been dead for over a century, the case established important precedents for historical justice and the recognition of crimes against enslaved people. More importantly, the investigation inspired similar efforts at other historical sites throughout the South. Archaeological teams began examining other abandoned plantations, looking for evidence of untold stories and unmarked graves. Genealogists worked to connect modern families with their enslaved ancestors. Historians began incorporating paranormal testimony into their research, recognizing that sometimes the dead have stories that the living need to hear. Sarah continued her work as a paranormal investigator, but her experience at Magnolia Grove had changed her approach fundamentally. She no longer sought ghosts for the thrill of the supernatural. She sought them as teachers, as witnesses to history, as voices that needed to be heard and stories that needed to be told. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had taught her that death is not the end of a story. It's simply a transition to a different kind of existence. Love survives death, dignity transcends mortality, and truth has a way of emerging even after centuries of silence. As Sarah drove away from Magnolia Grove for the final time, she carried with her not just the memory of an extraordinary paranormal investigation, but the knowledge that she had been privileged to serve as a bridge between the living and the dead, between the past and the present, between injustice and recognition. The 200 slaves who had died at Magnolia Grove were no longer ghosts. They were ancestors, teachers, and eternal reminders that every life has value, every story deserves to be told, and every soul deserves to be remembered with dignity and love. Their freedom had finally come, not in the way they had originally planned, but in the form of eternal peace and everlasting memory. The ghosts of Magnolia Grove had found their rest at last. The end. This haunting tale explores themes of historical injustice, the power of memory, and the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. Through the paranormal investigation format, it addresses the real horrors of slavery while honoring the humanity and dignity of those who suffered under that system. The story serves as both entertainment and education, reminding readers that behind every historical statistic were real people with real lives, dreams, and stories that deserve to be remembered.